Good morning and welcome to today's event, Africa in the Indo-Pacific Construct, brought to you by the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs and Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you could hear me?
I can hear you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Achala Gunasekara-Rockwell, Assistant Editor of the Journal and a Senior Member of the Consortium. Today's event is linked to the journal's recent special issue on the theme of Africa and features 3 of the authors from that issue. Before we get underway, please allow me to issue the following disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed or implied in JIPA are those of the authors and should not be construed as carrying the official sanction of the Department of Defense, Air Force, Air Education and Training Command, Air University, or other agencies or departments of the US government or their international equivalents. Now I would like to introduce the moderator for today's event, Ms. Rushali Saha. Rushali is a qualitative research analyst for The Diplomat, a freelance contributor to 9-Line, and a researcher writer for the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. She previously served as a research associate at the Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi. She holds a master's degree in politics with international relations from Djibouti University. Her research interests include the evolving geopolitics of South Asia and the Indo-Pacific region with a specific focus on Indo-China relations and Indian foreign policy. Rushali, we are delighted to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Achala. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you and Dr. Ernest and Air University for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this wonderful panel in the modest capacity of a moderator today. So thank you so much. Firstly, I'd like to welcome all our audience members and our star-studded panel today. So I see Major Ryan has still not joined, but we'll begin with the introduction of our panelists, and we hope he joins soon. So we have with us today Dr. Scott M. Edmondson, who is an assistant professor of Regional and Cultural Studies, Africa, at the Air Force Culture and Language Center. He has more than 8 years of teaching experience in University of California and University of Michigan and in military settings. Dr. Edmondson has conducted ethnographic field research in West Africa on popular media production and religious movements, and has worked as a socio-cultural intelligence analyst for the US Army Special Operations Command and US Africa Command. His teaching and research interests include African religious media and security studies, globalization in post-colonial theory, ethnography, semiotics and narrative analysis, military cross-cultural competence, youth cultures, social media, and radicalization and conflict. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for joining us today. We're humbled to have you. We also have with us
Thanks for having me.
Hi, thank you so much. We also have with us Mr. Robert Dabaly, who is a human rights defender, lawyer, and a Master's of Law candidate, International Humanitarian Law at the University of Essex. His research interests include international security, counterinsurgency, extremism, symmetric or asymmetric kinetic warfare, and peacekeeping operations. Thank you so much, Mr. Dabaly, for joining us today. We also have with us Major Ryan CK Hess, US Air Force, who serves as a senior intelligence officer for the Air Force's 49th Wing. Prior to this assignment, he was a graduate student at National Defense University, where he earned a master's degree in strategic security studies. Major Hess received his commission in 2010 from the United States Air Force Academy. On 2 separate occasions, he was deployed in support of Operation Nomad Shadow as a member of the US Embassy in Ankara's Office of Defense Cooperation team in Turkey, and in support of Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq as a military advisor to the Iraqi Air Force. So without further ado, I'll begin the discussions. Just to brief you on the format of it, I've prepared a set of questions for you based on your area of expertise, of course, and the contribution which you've made to the journal. And I would request the audience members to definitely go through and read it in case you haven't still. it's insightful, to say the very least. I personally learned a lot from that, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion and to hear your views. So I'd like to begin with Dr. Scott. So you've spoken in your piece, you've spoken a lot about Washington's attitude towards Africa and the Indo-Pacific construct. I'd like to begin with that. So in the 2018 Africa policy rollout, we saw the then National Security Advisor Bolton, who accused China and Russia of targeting their investments in Africa to gain a competitive advantage over the United States and engaging in predatory business practices in the region. US military officials have also expressed their concerns about the strategic implications of China's presence in Africa. It seems that Washington's thinking about Africa is being shaped vis-a-vis China, which of course you highlight in your piece as well. So can you tell me a little bit about how you see Washington's policy in Africa, whether there has been a change in the Africa policy under the former Trump administration, or do you think Washington's attitude towards Africa has been structurally flawed to begin with?
Thank you. That's kind of a big question, and I'll do the kind of hedging of saying, yeah, yes and no. There has been some changes under the Trump administration. I mean, I think consensus among analysts and scholars, since the end of the Cold War, there has been, broad bipartisan support for U.S. engagement with Africa aid and other initiatives. The issue is that that U.S. Africa policy has probably not necessarily been, highly, prioritized in general, mostly peripheral, and that has been continuous with the Trump administration. And, also to be fair to all administrations, is based on, political will and support from the American people, whose support to foreign aid in general and towards Africa has probably waned as well. So, every administration seems to have a kind of a signature policy and success story. The Trump administration included, with George W. Bush, it was PEPFAR, the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, which has been credited with saving, even millions of lives. Obama's, which kind of came later in his administration, programs like the Young African Leaders Initiative or YALI, Empower Africa. And again, the problem is kind of always one of scale and impact. I mean, those that win the sort of fellowship lottery with YALI, are amazing people. Every single one I've met, I've been blown away by, and that network is growing and, making impacts. But on a continent of over 1 billion folks, primarily young people, there could be more of them. For example, Empower Africa and these other kinds of initiatives are probably things that need to be judged on a longer term basis, as these investments and the benefits and coming out of the energy sector take a while to show up. But if U.S. Africa policy has been kind of lower priority, broadly supported but kind of lower priority for a while, I do think it's probably fair to say it reached some low points in the Trump administration, seen in cuts to all sorts of programs and agencies and understaffed embassies and, and beyond kind of the strategic communication flubs like the infamous, shithole countries comment and, Melania showing up on Safari with a pith helmet and, or firing the Secretary of State Tillerson via tweet during his, the first kind of high-level official visit to Africa. I think the more substantive criticism, however, as you mentioned, Bolton's speech and the kind of the December 2018 policy rollout, was that it was too kind of fixated and focused on China, less of a kind of a Africa policy and oh no, China is an Africa policy. And generally, I would concur with those criticisms. That said, a better, a good step, I think, in a better direction was the Prosper Africa framework, which again, even though focused on competing or being a kind of an attempt to push back against BRI or the Belt and Road Initiative, versus necessarily focusing on strengthening those kind of ties with African partners themselves. I do think it's a framework through which the U.S. can move beyond a primarily aid-based development model, which has its own pitfalls, like whether it's just paternalism or the difficulty of sustainability, or some of the unintended effects where aid can undermine local industries and labor and that sort of thing. So and the Biden administration, I think, is trying to reinvigorate that Trump initiative. So it's so a bit of a change, but at the same time there's continuity across the administrations. And I will just say, at the end, in terms of structural flaws, from the beginning, the West in general for a long time has had the attitude or kind of a worldview of seeing Africans as proxies and as pawns, as means to an end, instead of treating African partners as ends in themselves. In classes and courses, I frequently show that image or that etching of the Berlin Conference at the end of the 19th century, when the European powers were carving up the continent, not in consultation with those who were affected by those decisions. Not to make the argument that the U.S. or the West is still engaged in some sort of territorial colonial expansion, but those sorts of paternalistic attitudes, these notions of a tiered world, of a kind of a hierarchy of humanity, can persist. And our African partners are a lot of times now, but not always, treated as peers and not always around the table when we're formulating policy and making those plans. So I think the more in which we do treat Africans as peers and include those partner perspectives from the outset, that's best practice. And there are some examples of that. And it's, I think that's the best way to develop a U.S. Africa policy that's sustainable on the ground.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And I'll come back again to your discussion about how Washington is treating Africa as the means to an end rather than an end in itself. So thank you so much for that. That really contextualizes our discussion a lot. I'd like to move on to Major Hess now. Welcome. We've already introduced you to our audience, and I'll jump straight to the question now. Major Hess, I was wondering if you could explain to us Africa's geostrategic importance in the larger Indo-Pacific context, and whether Washington has seen Africa as a substantial Indo-Pacific player.
Of course, and first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this illustrious event. Regarding the importance of Africa, the first most important thing to identify is, of course, just its strategic location in general. When we're talking about East Africa specifically, that represents the western side of the Indo-Pacific region. And more importantly, perhaps on sort of the global scale, East Africa and Africa in general represents sort of the gatekeeper between the Mediterranean and the rest of Europe and the rest of the Indo-Pacific. So it sort of represents this linchpin between two major world economies and, of course, major world regions. And as a result, that has knock-on effects militarily, politically, and even culturally. Furthermore, when we talk about just talking about the location in general, we've seen multiple great powers, to include India, of course, China, which we sort of sometimes fixate on, but other powers like Turkey, Japan, of course, the United States, France, many of the European powers, identifying East Africa and then Africa on the whole as being crucial centers of whether it be military power, political power, or merely just trade power in general, all of these countries have identified African ports and African countries as being vital to their interests. And in some ways, the identification of these African countries and African ports and stops along these trade routes are sort of a self-licking ice cream cone, in the sense that when one country identifies it as being important, that therefore makes it important, which then increases its importance on a global and then the Indo-Pacific realm. I don't want to just stop and fixate, however, on the military and the economic side of the house. While those are arguably the two most important pieces, Africa itself represents a myriad of other opportunities that have been identified, and I think will continue to be identified in the future as being vital to both the Indo-Pacific region, again, and then on a global scale. We're talking about, first of all, its surging population, which represents any number of opportunities, and then both in East Africa, where the Indo-PACOM region tends to focus, but also on the continent as a whole, there are opportunities in development. Dr. Scott mentioned some of the USAID vectors that we're trying to pursue, both the United States and, again, though on the world stage. Infrastructure and construction represent massive opportunities for both private businesses as well as governments. Again, we tend to fixate on some of the investments that China is doing, but there are a myriad of countries, the United States included, that are looking to capitalize on infrastructure and construction, telecommunications, healthcare, and, like I said, a myriad of other sectors, all the way from agriculture all the way to rare earths and mining. So both on the military and the trade side of the house, and then the business side of the house, private and government led. And then, of course, even culturally, when we talk about sort of Nollywood and some of the cultural touchstones that Africa brings to the fore, the continent represents a increasing level of importance, and then like I said, a touchstone of importance for both the Indo-PACOM region and then globally as well.
Thank you so much, Major Hess. Since you brought up the question of infrastructure, taking on that, my next question is for Mr. Dabaly. I think you'd agree with me when I say that infrastructure, specifically infrastructure which is to address maritime security threats, in Africa has not been given enough attention. So what do you think is Washington's attitude towards the peculiar maritime threats that Africa faces? Has it done enough in helping African countries address these threats? And if not, what more can it do?
I believe that's a challenging question. I cannot presume to know more about the threats faced by African states than the intelligence gathering capabilities of Washington. I do believe that there are peculiar threats to critical national infrastructure for maritime security in Africa. These threats relate to the control and operation of maritime infrastructure. There is the possibility that activities to subvert democratic ideology can be propagated and enhanced for ulterior motives. That's what I wish to state.
Right, thank you so much. I'll carry on with the theme of Washington's role in Indo-Pacific and Africa and Indo-Pacific a bit longer, and I'll place my next question to Dr. Scott, if you may. If you can tell us a little bit more about Biden's reset in US-Africa relations. We've also read that there are reports that Biden is planning to host a US-Africa summit. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the thinking going on in Washington right now in terms of bringing Africa back into the focus, and how does this fit in with its larger Indo-Pacific strategy?
Yeah, I think we're all waiting on with some bated breath for the actual strategy and policy documents to roll out. I'm hearing kind of early in the new year, and I think there's so far there's hope among Africa watchers with a lot of senior cabinet officials with deep Africa experience, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, our ambassador to the UN, and Samantha Powers, USA director, and others, and really there seem to be signs of really bringing in a lot of folks with Africa expertise into the administration. So there may be substantial policy changes. Rhetorically, there has been positive signals, and I'm not dismissing rhetoric. I think rhetoric matters. When Secretary Blinken was recently on the continent, I think he was in Nigeria when he said, we don't want to make you choose between us and China or someone else. We want to give you choices. I think that's better, strategic communication than we had 3 years ago, probably. But proof and pudding and all that, what kind of wait to see. In terms of, figuring into Indo-Pacific policy, I'm not sure I'm the one to ask about that necessarily. But for example, if you read the AFRICOM posture statement, it definitely mentions China and strategic competition. If you read Indo-PACOM's posture statement, however, it doesn't really mention Africa because the sort of western border, so to speak, of its area of responsibility is really kind of India and the Maldives, and that's as far over as it goes. So I do think that structurally with DOD's combatant commands and the various bureaus at the State Department, the way they are set up for the organizations and the structures that have the Indo-Pacific as their responsibility, Africa is not necessarily on this map. If you go to the Indo-PACOM website, for example, and you pull up the map, it literally you don't see the east coast of Africa on it. But maybe the others who follow our Indo-Pacific policy better can correct me, and it doesn't mean there's not a growing awareness that Africa should be included in the Indo-Pacific. Hence, the addition of your journal and this panel. I would point to a couple pieces of recommended reading in these regards. One is by Zach Verton called Great Power Rivalry in the Red Sea. This was suggested to me by a U.S. ambassador in the Horn. And there's some pieces in there that urge both the U.S. State Department, DOD, to do better working across the seams, so to speak, between, the combatant commands and where those kind of territories are laid out. And where we're sometimes weak, we're kind of working across those seams or siloed, for example. The other piece I would suggest is from an Africa-based think tank, the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, urging African leaders to be a part of this sort of geopolitical frame. I think the title is, let me get it right, Africa Must Stake Its Claim in the Indo-Pacific. Pretty frank and direct. And maybe our own sort of policies and strategies can be hip to and support that as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I would also add our journal in that reading list, and definitely the writings by the three of you, like I mentioned at the beginning of this event, that they're definitely a must read, and I would urge our audience to read it if they haven't already. So yeah, since you've already introduced the theme of great power competition in Africa and in the Pacific, my next question comes for Major Hess. And I would like to ask you about the reports which are coming in about a lot of Chinese security firms emerging quite rapidly in Africa without a strong regulatory framework. While there are, of course, Western mercenary companies in Africa as well, but I think the difference here is that these reports indicate that these are not, the Chinese firms are not private. They're state controlled, they cater to state interest, the Chinese state interest. So how do you see this development? Is this a national security threat to the continent at large? And does it directly or indirectly affect US national interests?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I hadn't done much thinking about prior to this edition of the journal coming out. When I started doing my research, however, I would say that first and foremost, I find this to be relatively unsurprising. The amount of investment that China has dedicated towards Africa and the number of companies that China has sent in the direction of the African continent, it was almost inevitable to a certain extent that there would be a security aspect outside of the People's Liberation Army that would have cropped up as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I guess I'm focusing, of course, on Africa, but this could be said for the entire Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the Maritime Silk Road, that anytime you have sort of adventurism, whether it be military or economic or business adventurism, you're inevitably going to start to see security entities sort of follow that adventurism across the, in this case, the Belt and Road or the MSR. Excuse me. Additionally, as I said, I think it's sort of unsurprising, just given that we've seen an uptick in retaliatory attacks or just attacks in general against Chinese nationals and against Chinese business people and civilians who are attempting to, you know, make their livelihoods or to accomplish the objectives of their various businesses, or indeed of the CCP in general. We've seen an uptick of those attacks, and so again, I think it was sort of inevitable that we were going to see an uptick, a corresponding uptick in private security entities. The key here, and you identified it in the question, is that there is not really a regulatory framework behind or underpinning the increase in these security companies, the usage of these security companies, and that does represent a problem. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that it represents a threat yet. You know, anytime we talk about, you know, PMCs, private military companies, people have really dark views of sort of the black waters of the world, or the Russian mercenaries invading Ukraine and the Crimea. And while those are, of course, sort of the incredibly negative side of this, I don't think we've necessarily arrived there with these Chinese private military firms. That is not to say that that is not a definite potential eventuality for this, especially, as I said before, and as your question indicated, given there is very little regulatory framework. I think the real issue here, and the piece of this puzzle that is sort of the most dangerous, is that while for many countries that also utilize private military companies, there's sort of a separation of church and state a little bit, where the private military companies are doing their own thing. They don't necessarily represent the government, but they have that regulatory framework. In the case of the Chinese companies, they are one and the same as far as being part of the government, just like almost all of China's state-owned enterprises. While they sort of have the facade, I guess you could call it, of being a private company, we all know that they are, again, state-owned enterprises. And I think the same holds true for the private military companies. And so what you're dealing with then is essentially an outgrowth of the Chinese Communist Party without a legal framework, but with the plausible deniability that might come with being a private military company. So while, again, I don't necessarily think we've arrived at a point where this represents a direct threat either to the people on the African continent or US interests in general, because thus far these companies have been used mostly for, to my knowledge, you know, simply defense of Chinese companies and Chinese facilities. What they do represent is a potential threat, and second to that, they also are going to continue to enable Beijing to take and hold the initiative at a time when, you know, direct military clashes are relatively rare. So in as much as the Belt and Road Initiative represents a threat, these companies are essentially defending that threat. So again, I don't want to sort of hammer this home too hard, but I don't think we've arrived yet at the point where specifically these companies represent a threat. But in as much as China's operations in Africa represent a threat, these companies are enabling that threat.
Right. Thank you so much, Major Hess. And we will come back to the theme of China's influence and interest in Africa. But before that, let me come to Mr. Dabaly. And I would like to know your perspective on how you see Africa's maritime approach. Do you see a better coherence there? Is African Union playing a role in that coherence, or is it still, you know, like, do you see the unity in Africa's maritime approach? That's my question to you.
I believe there is coherence in Africa's maritime approach. US Naval Forces, Europe-Africa Sixth Fleet, appears to foster cooperation and coordination of African maritime security. However, African states can benefit from streamlined military capabilities, this being the provision of aircraft carriers, submarines, among others. I believe that it may be appropriate to include countries like Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria as part of NATO. USS Mount Whitney should be able to conduct urban operations training and counterterrorism in Africa.
Right. Thank you so much. Interestingly, you spoke about Egypt's inclusion, in the African states' inclusion in NATO. And off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to my head right now is about the recently concluded League of Democracies. So we saw a lot of African states participating in that. So Dr. Scott, my question to you would be, what do we read of this, like Washington's inclusion of African states into the League of Democracies? Do you see this as a genuine change in Washington's approach to encourage democracy, governance, peace, stability in Africa? Or are there larger underlying strategic goals, which would be, again, to cater Chinese influence in the region through this ideological pillar of democracy?
Yeah, I do think that that's going to be an emphasis, both in terms of our messaging and in terms of our policy. And if you look at survey data and other forms of research, most people, most African citizens do prefer democracy, or a more democratic system, more representative form of governance. Of course, they don't like existing in authoritarian and predatory states. And some empirical research by folks like Nick Cheeseman and others is that democracies tend to be better for economic development as well, and sort of socioeconomic progress. And this makes sense if you autocracy and authoritarianism, for example, can enable kind of a resource curse and corruption and state vampirism and all that sort of stuff. It's not black and white, however, in terms of the support for democracy or not. There are divides between, obviously the elites or those in power, and African masses, or generational divides, and others. And even those who would support, or prefer living in a more democratic country or in a system of more representative governance, doesn't mean they're not also, disappointed with some of the electoral, politics and processes that tend to be, it can be, flashpoints for, violence or other forms of insecurity. And there has been some, I think, backsliding, and democracies being challenged, not only in Africa, but I think globally. And so there could be an appeal of a kind of a Chinese model of strong central control, sort of state-driven development. Look at Rwanda, for example. It's sort of not exactly a democracy and has strong central control and that sort of thing, but that's also held up as a kind of a success story for development. So and our own kind of demonstrating that democracy works or doesn't, our own democratic failures don't help in these regards, I think. And again, we have to kind of acknowledge the role that some of our own domestic issues, have an impact on our foreign policy, and certainly the way we our credibility in terms of promoting democracy and that democracy works. Again, not trying to be partisan or anything here, but you know, a U.S. president did try to discredit a free and fair election in the democratic process, and you know, and urged supporters to stop that process, you know, earlier this year. So, you know, as an American, I'm still, frankly, trying to get my head around that to some degree. And of course, for African citizens looking at all of this, it's not helpful when we're trying to promote democracy, rule of law, rules-based order. You know, the main kind of argument or talking point that we have tried to salvage, which I think is legitimate, is that because of our strong institutions, you know, that prevented, you know, the strong man from usurping power not given to him by a majority of the people. So we can point to, you know, some of prior administrations' rhetoric was based on promoting strong institutions, not strong men in Africa. And this is in some ways proof that that's good. You know, no country's perfect, no political system perfect, and we cannot wait for ours to be to promote democracy and to hold the upcoming Summit for Democracy, for example. I think, you know, my argument is that, you know, we just kind of have to press forward with some degree of humility and solidarity. Kind of we're all in this together. We have to have kind of openness to various models for what democracy looks like in different places, to support generally those working towards a more democratic politics and principles and representative governance globally. And that's a good, I think, in its own right. And I argue that, you know, long term, although democracies and electoral politics has caused what looks like instability in the moment and the short term, I think long term, you know, democracy, social, environmental justice, you know, just broader based political, economic enfranchisement bode better for security and stability on the continent. But if one needs the sort of strategic competition argument or GPC justification, you know, the Russian and the Chinese engagement is fairly dependent in a lot of ways on authoritarian systems and political models to be able to kind of do what they're doing. And so, you know, any way we can not entrench authoritarian rule, I think also helps, you know, compete against those who are trying to leverage those kind of authoritarian networks for their own benefit.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. And I completely agree with your assessment. Rising authoritarianism around the world is a real problem. And I think every country should do its bit. And this is definitely a positive step in that direction. I do agree with you. Thank you so much. So Major Hess, with you, I'll come back to the China question again, because we do have questions pouring in on this, and given your expertise and your practical experience, I think you're best suited to answer these questions. So my question is fairly straightforward, and if you could give us a little bit of insight on what are the motivations behind Chinese engagement in Africa? The economic, political, security, are they more dominated by, you know, the economic considerations of the resources in the region, or is there an underlying security motivation behind the increased Chinese engagement with the African states?
That's a good question. And I'll say first and foremost, I don't know that I would fully separate out the economic motivations from the national security motivations. I think in many ways, and this could potentially apply to any country that is moving outside of its own borders, but I think particularly with the Chinese Communist Party, the national security question is so intertwined with the economic question, especially when you consider some of the state-owned enterprises and how much oversight the state has over these companies. I think splitting those two things apart is difficult to the point of being almost an exercise in futility. So switching over then to some of the motivations, I kind of covered it a little bit when I talked about the importance of Africa on the global stage, in the sense that currently the continent represents opportunities in a myriad of different sectors. We're talking about telecommunications, which is a sector that the Chinese and their state-owned enterprises have really, gone in hard on and tried to make sure that they were sort of the preeminent entity controlling the telecommunications realm for the African continent. Particularly, they've done quite a good job of it, better than us in almost every instance that I can think of at the very least. Development, again, there's development, infrastructure, construction, that sort of thing. There's been a massive amount of investment on the part of the Chinese over the last 10 years, and even going further back than that. I think prior to this year, it was $60 billion that was overall invested in the African continent, much of which was given to the infrastructure and telecommunications side of the house. This year, after the FOCEC conference, a lot of folks were saying that that China has been sort of stepping back from that, that they're only investing approximately $40 billion, so a $20 billion decrease in how much they're investing in development, infrastructure, construction, that sort of thing. And that is true, but I don't necessarily think that it represents stepping back from the Chinese, because another sector that they're looking to invest heavily in is the healthcare sector. And depending on how they price vaccines, they're looking to invest approximately $20 billion in COVID-19 vaccines on the continent as well. So if you look at just the $40 billion, you say, oh, that's a $20 billion decrease, until you look at the fact that they're also investing in healthcare. So they're not decreasing their investment on the continent, they're just diversifying it in some ways. And I think that's an important aspect where in some ways, infrastructure, construction, development, that's gotten them a little bit of hot water, them being the Chinese in this case. That's gotten them occasionally in some hot water with some of the debt trap accusations. So we're seeing them, I think, diversify their portfolio of investment. All of this, however, goes a long way to explain their motivation, which is, of course, an economic one, garnering money and the benefits that come along with having their hands in all of these various sectors. But I think there's an additional motivation that speaks more to the political or national security side of the house, which is sort of an information warfare perspective. The more that they can be represented on the continent in a positive light, or at least have the facade of a positive impact, I think that is almost more valuable to them than the economic benefits that they're going to receive from some of those things. And that is probably most acutely seen in their delivery of, if they're able to accomplish it, the delivery of $20 billion worth of vaccines. If they can be seen as being a positive force, especially as opposed to the United States, I think that's almost a bigger win for them, and that's a larger motivation. A really good example of this, aside from the COVID-19 vaccines, was, and I'm going to potentially get some of the specifics here wrong, but Chinese minister met with Abiy Ahmed, the prime minister of Ethiopia, and I don't know what happened, of course, in that meeting, but afterwards, the Chinese minister made some commentary to the effect of, we don't get involved in other countries' issues, and we think that Ethiopia has the wisdom and the knowledge to handle their internal issues, and those issues are internal and are none of China's business. And the way that it was worded and the way that they discussed the Ethiopian problem was clearly a direct refutation of the actions of the United States, or their perception of the actions of the United States. And so I think even more than the economic, you have on the political side of the house, their attempts and their motivation to win the information warfare conflict. And I think to them, in many ways, that will be more valuable. And indeed, one of the questions that we have in the chat has to do with investments being leveraged should there be a conflict in the East of the South China Sea. And the most obvious and direct answer to that question would be that they would leverage some of the economic benefits being wrought by their state-owned enterprises, some of the money flowing in to the Chinese Communist Party. That's the direct investment. However, I think the investment that they're making in the information space, the investment that they're making in influence and in perception, I think that is really what they would want to leverage the most should a conflict erupt anywhere in the world, frankly. And so, yeah, I think that represents one of their greatest motivations.
Thank you so much, Major Hess. And I think it's very interesting that you brought up the diversification of Chinese investments, since so much focus goes into BRI and infrastructure, that these hidden, so to say, investments somewhere get lost, but they're equally important and equally strategic, if I may say so. Thank you very much for that. So now my next question is something which I would request all panelists to share their views, but I would of course direct it to Mr. Dabaly, given your area of expertise in this, of course. Now, of course, we've seen that US's troop withdrawal from Afghanistan has received a lot of attention, but not so much attention has been given to Washington's full removal of troops from Somalia. So, Mr. Dabaly, can you tell me something about maybe the African perceptions of this troop withdrawal from Somalia? How are they perceiving it? Is Washington being viewed negatively? Is this decision ill-timed, as a lot of reports are calling it? And if Somalia is about to become the next Afghanistan?
As a Kenyan, I believe that it's concerning, and I believe the African opinion is divided. I do not know more than Washington. What is evident is that Somalia has invited other foreign states to assume Washington's role, such as Turkey. I believe that Washington can prevent a similar collapse as experienced in Afghanistan by engaging in diplomatic supervision and conducting reconnaissance to verify facts on the ground, to provide neighboring African states with intelligence so that the same is reflected in security policies. Consequently, investigative agencies can promptly act to any immediate security threat. Overall, it appears that management of borders is something that's left to the jurisdiction of the state. So what could potentially be beneficial would be for the US to support neighboring countries with necessary facilities to ensure that security is provided.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dabaly. Major Hess, if I could invite you for your comments on this. Do you think Somalia will become the next Afghanistan?
That potential certainly exists. I'm wary of making such a dire prediction, and obviously I certainly hope that it doesn't. But that there is that potential, and I think the removal of troops from Afghanistan was somewhat short-sighted. Again, I want to echo Dr. Dabaly in the sense that I don't know more than Washington, and I wouldn't presume to, but it seems to me that both from a military perspective, which is the obvious one, and again, I return to the information warfare perspective, where we have indeed left the door open for some of the competencies that we were bringing to the table to be covered by other foreign powers. And if that is indeed something that we're okay with, then that's one thing. However, I think the perception is one, at least in many cases, of abandonment. And if in fact Somalia does go down the path that Afghanistan has gone down, I think that while it might not be as acute as we saw in Afghanistan, I think that the perception is going to be that one of the catalysts behind that is the withdrawal of US troops. That said, I want to be clear that I don't necessarily know if the answer, now that's been done, the answer is a reintroduction of troops into the area. I think that would exacerbate an already difficult situation. There are ways in which both militarily, economically, and diplomatically, we can continue to support Somalia and ensure it doesn't necessarily go down that path. There are pathways that are not necessarily military or do not necessarily involve direct military action, which can result in the outcomes we're looking for in Somalia. But without a true presence there, unfortunately, those pathways become significantly more difficult and more complex.
Thank you so much. Dr. Edmondson, if I can invite you to give your comments on this, please.
Yeah, I would just add, it's always tricky kind of drawing analogies between, different countries and context. The way in which the Afghanistan effort, yes, it was an ISAF or NATO effort, but it was primarily sort of a US supported intervention and effort. And so then when we left, it was, ultimately catastrophic. I think it's different in Somalia in that you have, there were some issues with the election and all of that, but for the most part, kind of a leadership there, national leadership that's supported by the population. You have an Amazon mission, so there's already kind of a more multilateral effort in Somalia, so that I mean, full U.S. withdrawal would probably be detrimental to that, and there are ways in which we can continue to support that through by with and through our African partners there, that we might not have had in terms of if you think about the neighbors to Afghanistan, that we have in Somalia. So the contexts are a little different. Somalia has also been Somalia for 2 decades. So I don't know that it would be as sort of tumultuous of a withdrawal as Afghanistan was.
Right. Thank you so much for your perspective. So since of course we're running out of time and we do have a few audience questions lined up as well, this will be my last question to you. And it goes back to the great power competition narrative, which you've alluded to previously. We've seen there's a lot of talk going on now about, and you spoke about it yourself, about a neo-colonial mentality. I mean, neo-colonial is a strong word, but there's a scramble for Africa. A lot of people are saying that there's a second scramble for Africa. So how do you view that development? And do you think either Washington or China will ever become a dominant power in Africa?
Well, to hear some talk about it, China has already fully taken over the continent. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. And in terms of either the U.S. or China becoming a dominant force, ultimately, I think if we, truly seek security and prosperity in Africa, Africans, can't be dependent on any outside or dominant force. I don't think the U.S. is anywhere close to being a dominant force in that way. Major Hess mentioned the recent forum on China-Africa cooperation, and there were a lot of reports about how 6 years ago there were 15 African heads of state that came to that, and 3 years ago there were 50 that went to China for that. Less kind of head of state participation in the recent one, and Xi Jinping just made a virtual appearance. And so, there seems to be on the surface a kind of a scaling back, and BRI, kind of these massive infrastructure projects, I think have been scaled back. But to Major Hess' point, in some ways, those kind of big, they already have 42 or 46 ports or whatever it is in Africa already. So, it's time to diversify. And I do agree that some of the sectors where I have the most concern is, as Major Hess mentioned, in kind of in the media or the information environment, their ability to put out pro-Chinese media outlets, but also in the mobile communications technology realm. That's also a mobile banking realm and a mobile finance realm. And if the Chinese have sort of visibility and a cut of all of those transactions, that's kind of problematic. And that's not as sort of visible and high profile as, a new railroad or a sports stadium or that kind of thing, but kind of the ways in which they can be integrated into African economies in ways that are, potentially problematic. Not just for us, but for African populations. But if they are supporting a narrative that that they're greasing the wheels of global commerce and providing opportunities for African populations while we're still fixated on violent extremism or whatever the case may be, That's kind of how we're competing. I think if the discussion is kind of who's doing better, not who's becoming dominant, but who's doing better comparatively in terms of perception. I mean, I think that depends on the poll and the framing of the questions and who's asked. But in general, the U.S. and China both are fairly comparable in their positivity ratings. We might get a little nudge towards our political system. China might get more positive percentages for their development model or that kind of thing. I think for me, it doesn't really matter, how bad or exploitative or manipulative or whatever Chinese engagement is in Africa. The U.S. has to have more than a "Hey, China is bad" policy. Can't really call out the competitor if we can't adequately answer the question, well, what are my options and what do you offer? And we don't have to throw gobs of money at it either. Some of it just means like more fully staffing our embassies in Africa, for example, or having, kind of higher level engagements with African leaders, and cultivate what scholar Lena Ben Abdallah has referred to as relational productive power, instead of trying to compete with, which I think is what Major Hess was also referencing, instead of trying to compete dollar to dollar on infrastructure development, it's about the volume of things like educational exchanges, both civilian and military. It doesn't all have to be about sort of material impact or base building or that sort of thing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. Right, coming back to Major Hess, since you, of course, very aptly brought out the Chinese motivations and interests in Africa, my next question to you is somewhat ambitious, if I may put it so, but do you see a convergence of Chinese and US interests in Africa in terms of stability of Africa? And does something like climate change, is it something that US and China can work together to promote the development of Africa as a whole?
Is it something that China and the US can work together for? I think yes. There are definitely interests that we share, and there are interests that I would love to see both powers work together on. Climate change is one. I think healthcare and things of that nature are certainly another. Will that happen? Do I see that as a likely outcome in the near future? Unfortunately, no. I haven't seen anything to indicate to me that that's going to be in the future. I hope I'm wrong in that sense. But I think both nations, we definitely have an issue with, as Dr. Scott pointed out, of the China is bad policy and nothing else. And I think in some instances, China is guilty of the same thing in reverse. I think they do have a bit more investment that's much more obvious and much more tangible. But at the end of the day, I think, at least as things stand right now, it's unlikely there will be a lot of goal sharing between the two powers. And if I can sort of in some ways echo what Dr. Scott was saying as far as the dominant power on the continent, I think the ideal result would be that the Africans are dominant on the African continent. And obviously, if I have to choose between the United States or China, I have an obvious choice, but I would much prefer that neither power be the dominant power on China. And there is almost, and I may be making a comparison here that's sort of inaccurate and fraught with danger, but there's almost a free market option on the continent, in the sense that folks can choose from which foreign entity they want to work with and with whom they want to work with, and the indicator of who the favored partner is the fact that that entity gets them what they need and provides them with whatever services that they need. But at the end of the day, the decision is being made not by the powers that be, but rather by the Africans themselves. So again, I recognize that is a difficult analogy to make, but the point is I think that in an ideal world, we would be working with China in order to bring about more prosperity for the Africans, in order to ensure that the dominant power on the African continent is, of course, Africa. That said, unfortunately, I don't necessarily see that in the near future, but that would be a prediction that I would love to be wrong about.
Right. Thank you so much. So I think any discussion on Indo-Pacific is incomplete without reference to the Quad. But before I go on to my question for Mr. Dabaly, I would request the audience members, if you have any questions, to please post it on the chat. Please keep it brief and we'll get back to it. So right, as I was saying, any discussion on Indo-Pacific is incomplete without reference to the Quad. And that brings me to my question for you, Mr. Dabaly, is that there's been a lot of talk about maritime security and infrastructure in the Quad, and including in the latest summit, which was held in August. These were two areas of focus. They were identified as areas of focus. So do you think that Quad can work with the African states on these issues? And can Africa be a part of this dialogue mechanism? Maybe potentially even participation in a Quad Plus mechanism?
I believe that NATO patrols may be necessary to deter piracy, terrorism, and other gray zone activities. Also, the protection of shipping lanes and transnational trade are also vital for the prosperity of African economies. I do, however, believe that the Quad should play a major humanitarian role through the provision of COVID-19 vaccines, protective equipment and medical supplies, and where possible, medical treatment. I think the ability to engage Africa within the Quad will be dependent on the intention of each state to participate and how much they're willing to contribute.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Dabaly. As the questions pour in, I know, Dr. Scott, I told you that would be the last question, but I would really love to hear your perspectives on this as well, about Africa's inclusion in a possible Quad Plus dialogue and what role the African states can play in working with the Quad to address these issues of maritime security in the region.
Yeah, again, I'm not, I don't have very deep expertise in the Indo-Pacific or with regards to the Quad, but, you know, as an African is looking at it, it seems like you have to have some significant naval power to play, for one thing, and so that might be kind of a barrier for entry for most African states. But I do think, as according to the piece I referenced earlier, there are other things that the African states can offer in terms of helping to support the free and open trade in the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, I do think that they should push or agitate for a spot at the table, and then it's kind of up to the Quad to be open to that and to think that and to include them. I mean, you can't just I don't know how that sort of dance or chicken or the egg thing would work in terms of Africans asking to have a spot at the table and then to be granted one. But I do think that in the Indo-Pacific frame, if we don't cut off the map midway in the Indian Ocean, that would probably be a good thing.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. Major Hess, quickly, maybe in 2 minutes, if you can share your views on this, and then we can quickly move on to the audience questions.
I think, first of all, I'm like Dr. Scott in that I don't know that I'm necessarily expert on this particular topic. However, I also agree. I think that just understanding that the interests of the Quad and the interests of China and the interests of the U.S. don't stop at the edge of India or at the Pakistan border, but they continue on. And there's a lot of conversation in the Indo-Pacific realm regarding the transition through the Strait of Malacca into the South China Sea, into the Indian Ocean. And that is, of course, an incredibly important linchpin. But another linchpin is, as I said before, the Suez Canal that runs right next to East Africa. And if you don't want to go that direction, you, of course, have to go down the coast of Africa, around South Africa. So the point being that anything that excuse me, anytime we're going to discuss the Indo-Pacific as a whole, we of course have to include, at the very least, East Africa. And the Chinese certainly haven't, I guess you could say, forgotten Africa in their designs. And if you look at any graphic that involves the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, the final leg of it runs down Africa and then, of course, up into Eastern Europe. But the point is that they certainly have forgotten about it, and I think we are being somewhat myopic if we also fail to incorporate the benefits and, frankly, the risks involved in the African continent.
Right. Thank you so much. I will now inviting the audience questions. Please keep your questions brief and do mention who you are addressing your questions to. So if I may request Dr. Indu Saxena, if she's still there, I'm not sure, I can't see her. If you could please unmute yourself and ask this question. Dr. Indu Saxena, are you there? I don't see her right now. Okay, so in that case, I'll move on to Mr. Satrio Santosa. If you could please, Santoso, if you could please ask your questions. And like I said, please keep it brief and do mention who you're directing your question to. So if you could please unmute yourself and ask the question. Satrio Santosa, if I could please ask you to unmute yourself and ask the question. I think there's some problem there, so why don't I read out the question? So the question is addressed to all the panelists, which it says that how some African countries such as Ghana and Kenya have a huge debt to China. How do you see this going forward? Is BRI giving more benefits to African countries or instead challenges and hindrances? So it's for all the panelists. Whoever would like to go first, if you could please give a brief compact answer to this. If I could please request Dr. Scott to go first.
Yeah, it's the debt trap accusations, I think are largely valid. It's not as simple as that. I mean, it does provide the Chinese some leverage, but kind of watching this over the last 10 years, there's nuances and there's room for African agency that sometimes we don't account for so much. We think, oh well, China's going to get them in debt and then they're going to owe them something and then they're going to do everything that China asked them to, or they're going to go repossess some asset. I mean, what does it mean for the Chinese to repossess a highway in Cameroon? What does that give them? What does that mean? I do think it's something to be concerned about. I mean, if you look at the port and Djibouti, the Dorle port, for example, significant investment, I think, by the Emiratis initially, and ultimately, the Djiboutian government sort of nationalized the port. And gave some interest to the Chinese. Now, is there a connection between the fact that China holds a lot of Djibouti's debt? And the Emiratis went to a international court based out of, I think, the UK that ruled in their favor, but they're not getting their shares back. So I do think it's something to keep an eye on. I think there was recently a report about how they were going to, because the Ugandans didn't restructure a debt with the Chinese, that they're going to take over the international airport in Entebbe. That's in 20 years. So a lot can happen in 20 years. So I guess it just sort of remains to be seen. I think that it's interesting to read about all the different cases of it. I would suggest there's a China-Africa project at Johns Hopkins that has a lot of detailed reports on the specifics in different countries. It's not the same in different places, although there is a kind of a general approach that we're all wary of. But from a U.S. standpoint, if the Chinese do things that are seen as predatory, that are seen as detrimental to African economies and interest, then that's, strategically for us, I don't know that that's even, that's so much of a concern, because then it's sort of China falling out of favor. So yeah, I think Africans would be wary, but I think we shouldn't assume that Africans don't have eyes wide open on what's going on and how they might try to use Chinese loans to their own advantages or purposes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. Thank you. Mr. Dabaly, if you have any comments on this question.
I believe what is evident is that, including in Kenya and other African countries, is that some of these investments and loans require that these facilities are operated and the money or the proceeds are directed towards the Chinese government until the loan is satisfied. That may take an extensive amount of time. However, it does sort of weaken the ability of the countries to grow their own or generate their own revenues. Apart from that, the BRI does offer substantial or projected economic growth for the nations that are involved. It is multifaceted, and it does provide employment opportunities, but it, however, weakens the ability or flexibility of African states to renegotiate terms or to define their own economic agendas.
Thank you so much for that crisp answer, which really it covers the entire thing. Thank you so much for that. Major Hess, if you could let us know your views on this.
Well, I think the two previous answers have covered quite a bit of what needs to be said here. The only addition I think I would have is I think there also has to be some credence paid to the view that these African countries are taking, which in some cases I think is a very short-term view, and that's understandable. Because, in the case of, for instance, the highway in Cameroon, if you're an elected leader and there's an offer to build a highway in Cameroon that's going to help you get reelected, it's going to help you look incredibly good for your constituents, or earn you an immense amount of revenues in the short term, then regardless of what the potential long-term consequences are regarding loan repayment, it's really likely that you're going to take that opportunity, and you sort out what the loan repayment or whatever the issues are in the future. And again, in the case of that highway, I think if I were in the position of that local political leader or even the national leader, I would potentially look at that and say, this is a great short-term benefit and I can deal with the long term, but in the short term I need to either get reelected or to please my constituents, earn the revenue that's going to come in off of that. So I think that's just something to kind of understand. Is I think a lot of these countries are going into these potential debt traps with eyes wide open, but with an understanding that the short-term benefits outweigh the long-term risks.
Absolutely, thank you so much for that. So I think Dr. Indu Saxena's question was definitely directed towards you, so I'll ask you that. She says that China's naval base in Djibouti is big enough to carry an aircraft carrier, and it could easily accommodate 4 of China's nuclear power attacked submarines if required. What kind of threat or concerns do you think this presents to to America's Indo-Pacific interest or US hegemony in Africa? Major Hess, that's for you.
Sorry, I think on the one hand, it represents a significant threat. You know, the idea that on the doorstep of one of our bases, you have the potential for an aircraft carrier or a nuclear powered sub is of course an incredible threat, and one that the Africa Command and indeed the entire DoD needs to be very aware of and continue to monitor through intelligence channels and everything that we have at our disposal. That said, I would sort of temper that a little bit, and I admit I am not 100% sure the context of General Townsend's comments, but I would temper with a little bit that I don't know that it is in the interest of China to engage in a shooting conflict in anywhere near Djibouti. I don't see that as being in their interest. It certainly wouldn't be in our interest. So while the threat is present and it certainly represents something that needs to be monitored and considered, I don't necessarily think, you know, for a threat you have to have both capability and willingness, and the capability certainly exists based on these comments from General Townsend. I don't know that the willingness is there, and I think that's a key portion of this, because as I said, it's in no one's interest for naval assets to start shooting at each other in that vicinity. So I think it's an important consideration, but not necessarily a full threat yet.
Thank you so much. And I think that brings an end to the question answer session as well. We're running out of time. So let me take this opportunity to thank the three of you once again. It's been a great learning experience. We've all learned a lot from this. And I think it's very important and timely that we're having this webinar today to discuss something which I arguably is the future of the world at large. Africa will definitely play a very important role in the Pacific. And I do believe that conversations like this will bring more focus on the topic. And I hope to take this conversation forward from what I've learned from all of you. So thank you so much. Thank you once again for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. And I'd also like to thank the audience for your insightful questions and for your sustained participation. With this, I'd hand it over to Dr. Achala. If you could please take over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rushali. On behalf of the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs and Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers, I would like to thank our panelists for their insightful presentations and deft handling of the Q&A session. I would also like to express our gratitude to Rushali for her masterful moderation of the event. Thanks too to our audience for attending the event and for your engaging questions for our panelists. The success of any event is measured by the quality of all these factors, and I can say without any reservation that this has been a great success. Our panel has definitely presented us with a strong understanding of how Africa fits into the Indo-Pacific construct and the challenges and the opportunities that the continent faces. We are hoping to have a second such panel next month with the other authors who contributed to our special issue, and we hope you will all join us again for that event as well. Before we sign off, I would like to inform you some of the upcoming initiatives from the journal and the consortium. First, the winter issue of the journal was released earlier this week, featuring a piece from the US Special Operations Command focusing on asymmetric competition in the Arctic and other articles addressing topics ranging from Southeast Asian maritime and air power matters to French air power during the Afghanistan war and Quad-related issues in East Asia and Oceania. Coming later this month or early next, we will publish the latest iteration of our Indo-Pacific perspectives focusing on the Asian Gulf in the Indo-Pacific Construct. Edited by Dr. Peter Harris of Colorado State University, the new issue focuses on the Persian Gulf in the Indo-Pacific Construct. The journal, in collaboration with the book side of the AI University Press, is pleased to announce the launch of the new Kenny papers on Indo-Pacific security studies, the first of which is slated for publication early next year. These will be words lengthier than those typically published in the journal. Also next year, as we celebrate the journal's 5th year of publication, we are moving to a bi-monthly production cycle with regular thematic issues and continuous stream of out-of-cycle articles that will ensure a constant stream of our new material for our readership. The consortium will play a significant role in these transitions and in producing new materials. The think tank will be standing up its new website in the new year and producing its own original content therein. So for those of you in the audience that are so inclined, there will be a host of new opportunities to publish with our 2 organizations. For more information on these endeavors, contact the journal at jipa@au.edu or the consortium at consortium@Indo-Pacific Researchers.org. Be sure to revisit the journal's website to catch up on the many special issues we have produced this year, including our Africa in the Indo-Pacific content issue, and the Arctic strategy issue, which features articles from leaders at the new Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies, U.S. Special Operations Command, 11th Air Force, and more. Our next thematic issue will tackle the future of Afghanistan following the US withdrawal and the resurgence of the Taliban. Visit the YouTube channels for JIPA and the consortium, which feature panels like today's session, book discussions, and other Indo-Pacific related content. You can also find us on Twitter and LinkedIn, where we post not only our own content, but also share relevant materials by other regional subject matter experts. And be sure to tune into the Indo-Pacific Affairs podcast on your favorite platforms, including Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, DVids, and so forth. Finally, our colleagues with AI University Press produce a wide array of quality publications, all of which are open source and available for free download, including the recently published book, No Moment of Victory, which follow the course of the NATO training mission in Afghanistan. Again, thank you for attending today's session. We hope to see you here again when we restart our session in January. We wish you all a very happy and a very safe holiday season. Thank you very much.